Today I'm going to be showing you how to filter tables like this. And highlight tables like this. This sort of feature comes in very handy if you have a very long table with a lot of data and you need to be able to filter it. Today I'm going to show you how to do that right inside Oxygen. So let's jump into Oxygen. Now, if you haven't seen my previous tutorial on how to build dynamic data table, responsive dynamic data table, please check out this video. I'm going to link it at the top right corner here. In the previous video, we showed how to build a table that is responsive like this. And in this video, we're going to take it a step further by showing you how to filter and highlight the tables. All right, let's start. We have a table set up here. So what we're going to do here is we are not going to touch anything in the table. We are done with the table. Like I said, check out that video. And we are going to go to the table wrapper and we're going to drop in a form. Of course, you might wonder, Oxygen doesn't have a form. So how do you do that? Well, you can build a form because it's just HTML elements. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to drop a div there. I want to move that up. And then I'm going to call it search form. And then I'm going to give it a class, I'm going to change the ID to search underscore form. I'm going to go ahead and change the tag. I'm going to use a custom tag. I'm going to call it form. And that's all for the form. And then we're going to put in the form elements like the input. So we want to have the input. We want to have the radio button. We're going to have the label. So let's do that. Let's add a div inside that form. That div is going to be called a search input. That's what we're going to use for our search input. And I'm going to change the custom tag to input. And then I'm going to change the ID to search. Shall you spell it correctly? Search underscore input. Let me select that form and throw in another div. And that div is going to be our radio filter. And I'm going to change the tag to input. Let's change the ID to radio filter. We're going to add one more element. So I'm going to select the search form. I'm going to drop in another div. Actually, that is not going to be a div. That is going to be, I'm just going to drop in a text. And that text is going to be a label. So that is going to be the label for our radio filter. I'm going to change the tag to label. Now, these are proper HTML tag for form element. I'm going to go ahead and duplicate this div and move this one on top. And then this is going to be the radio highlight. I'm going to give it an ID of radio underscore highlight. Now I'm going to duplicate this label and then I want to move it under here. And that is going to be a label for our radio highlight. Now we have laid out all the form elements. Now let's go ahead and add the appropriate attributes to our form element. For the search input, I'm going to go ahead and add an attribute. I want to pin that, and that attribute is going to be the placeholder. And that placeholder, I want to write it filter names ... And you can see that turns out. I want to apply some styling to that input. So I'm going to give it a padding of 8 pixel. I'm going to give it a border radius of 50 pixels. And I'm going to give it a border. The border is going to be solid. 1 pixel. Gray. Now, Oxygen by default, forces divs to be minimum height and minimum width of 80 pixels. So we're going to override that and we're just going to give it a minimum height of 0. So that resets the Oxygen's default. Let's move to the next one. I'm going to move to the radio filter. To make it a proper radio button, we need to add 3 attributes. 1, 2, 3. I'm going to pin all of them. The first attribute we're going to add is going to be type attribute, which will define it as a radio. And the second one is going to be the value attribute, which I'm going to call it filter, because that's what we want to use to filter the table data. The third one is going to be an attribute called name, and that is responsible for grouping the series of radio buttons together. I'm just going to call it table radio button. Now for the first radio button, we want it to be checked by default. So I'm just going to add an attribute and then I'm going to say checked. And that doesn't require any value. Once you say checked, it's going to check by default. I'm going to apply that attribute And then you can see that we have a radio button. So if I remove that check, you can see it's not checked. Okay, so I'm going to apply that. And of course, it's really big because of the minimum width and height that Oxygen forces. So I'm just going to go into this and just change the minimum width and height to 0. Let's move to the label for the radio filter. Now that is going to take a couple of attributes. So I'm just going to go here. Actually, it's going to have just one attribute, which is going to be 4. Now this attribute is responsible in telling the browser which radio button has this label. So, and that value takes the ID of radio button. So I'm just going to copy the ID. I'm using Recorder Workspace, so I double click here to copy it. All right, so I'm going to pin this, all right, and I'm going to paste it. So now it recognizes that this label is for this radio button. What's the advantage of that? The advantage is so that you can click the label to select the radio button, just like this. So if I click here, you see I'm able to select the radio button by clicking on the label. Without that, I will need to come in here to click directly on the radio button itself. Let's move to the next one. This other radio button is called highlight. So I'm just going to copy that ID because it's going to be easier for us to just duplicate this one and replace with this one. I'm going to just duplicate this. I'm going to move it here, and I'm going to delete this one, and then I'm going to just call this radio highlight. So this is going to be, the value is going to be highlight here. The name is going to be the same, so it recognizes that it's the same group. And I think that's basically all for that. The name signifies the grouping of the radio buttons. So now these two radio buttons have the same name. That is why it responds. So if I click this one, unchecks. If I check this one unchecks. Without them having the same name, I'll be checking both of them at the same time. So both of them will remain checked at the same time. So giving it a name enables them, to alternate. Now let's move to this radio label. I'm going to give it an attribute of 4, and then of course it's going to be for that radio highlight, which is the ID of this one, which we should update. When we duplicated it, we lost that ID. So we have everything we need now. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to change this, call this filter names, and I'm going to change this and call this highlight table data. Let's add some styling to space it out. For the search input, I'm just going to go in and give it a padding of 1 rem. Sorry, did I say padding? That's wrong. It's supposed to be a margin of 1 rem. And then for the filter label, I'm going to go in and give it a margin left of, let's say, 0.8 rem. And for the radio highlight, I'm going to go in and give it a left margin of 1 rem. And for the highlight, I'm going to go in and give it a left margin of 0.8 rem. And then for the search input, I want to quickly go to the mobile breakpoint because I don't want this to look like this. So I'm going to go into that custom CSS at that breakpoint. I'm going to set it to display block. It's not working, so we need to override something. So we're just going to add important there. So it pushes these other ones down. And then these ones, I think I would like to bring down the font size to, let's say, 1.2 rem, maybe 1.4 rem. And for these, I would like to do the same thing. Okay. Now for the search form, I just want to give it a bottom margin of 2 rem. Let's move it away from the table. I'm going to save this, and then I'm going to refresh the front end to see how a table works. So let's see. Okay, so everything works, the way it's supposed to look. Yep. So now we need to put the search functionality, the filtering, and the highlighting. And we are going to need to use a JavaScript for that. So I'm going to select this section and drop in a code block. Let's move that code block to there, and then I'm just going to change it to table filter. So table filter code, and I will just comment this out, and then I'll go into the JavaScript section. Let's expand it. I've already written out my code. I'm just going to copy it in and explain to you what it does. So the first thing we're going to do is that we want to get the the search form. So document.getElement by ID. So we are getting this search form. So we've stored that in a variable called search form. The next thing we're going to do is to get this. Now I don't want to spend time typing out the code so that the video will not take too long. The next one is to get the search input. So I'm getting that search input because by the ID that we gave it, search input, and then we're going to get both table data. So the highlight radio is going to be the, this one, that one we had radio highlight, and yep, and then the filter, the radio filter is going to be this other one. So we've placed them inside a variable. And then I'm going to add an event listener. Now what I want to do here is I want to add an event listener. Once we click, we want to call this function. Now that function has not been created yet, so I'm going to create that function. Now the reason for that function is to check which of these radio button is being clicked. I'm going to copy that function. Now I'm going to explain what is going on here. Now what is going on here is this. So we're creating a function, and then we're saying if highlight radio dot check, that if this button, this particular one, is being checked. Now we are calling a function, and we are saying reset filter. Now this is going to be a different function. Now what we want to do is this. Take a look at this. Now we have this filter, and then so you see Dan. Okay, now when I click this, I want it to reset. I want it to, reset. Now without that reset, when we click this, maybe we click this and we type Dan. Okay, now if we click this, it will remain like this. It's not going to reset. So we need to reset it, and then we're going to write this function for the reset. Then we are saying search input. We're going to add event listener to the search input. On key up, we're going to call another function that is called highlight data, and we're going to write that function. And then we want to change the attribute for the search input. So the attribute we want to change is the placeholder. So you can see that, let me clear this out. You see, this is written highlight table data, but when I click here, the placeholder changes to filter names. So that's what we are doing here. So we are taking that input, and then we are setting an attribute. So if we check the highlight button, now if we check this, we'll do the opposite. We're going to reset the highlight, and then we're going to call a function filter names, and then we're going to set this attribute to filter names. Let's go ahead and put our function for the filter names. So I'm going to copy the function, and then I'm going to explain what is going on here. So now our function filter name, what it does is this. The first thing in that function, it checks if the highlight radio is checked. Now, if the highlight radio is checked, we don't want this function to run because this function is a filter function. It's not the highlight function. So we're going to get the value of the input, whatever is typed in here, and then we're going to convert it to uppercase. The reason that is going to happen is so that when we are comparing it to whichever values in the table data, which we're also going to convert to uppercase, everything with all the case will match. Then we're going to get the table row. Of course, we are selecting the table row based on the table class that we've given. Each of the table rows that we had here had a class. So this table row has a class of .tr. And then we're going to loop through each table row, and then we're going to get the name attribute, which we had for I think that it was the second one, which had this attribute of name. So we're going to get that table row that has the attribute of name. We're going to compare the table data in that row with the values that we have in the input, and if it matches, we're not going to do anything. So we set the display to nothing. We're not going to set the display to anything. But if it doesn't match, we're going to set the display of the parent row to none. So that is what happens here. So when you type, the ones that doesn't match, they are set to, the display is set to none. But if it matches, the display remains the way it is. Now for the next thing is we have to find a way to reset this. This is the highlight. Okay, this is the filter. This is the filter. But so when we click highlight, we want to reset this filter. This is what we are doing here. So to reset that, I've written a function for that, which I'm going to put in here. This function is basically almost like this, except that it doesn't have this if statement. So it just, you know, set the display to no value, and so that if I type something here and then I click another one, it resets those display none properties. We have a function for the filter, so we want to put the function for the highlight and also reset the highlight. So I'm not going to explain the highlight again because it's exactly the same thing except that it's highlighting. Maybe I'm just going to go through it to see the difference. The only difference in the highlight on is that we are not selecting a particular data label. We are selecting all the data label because we want to highlight everything. And in this one, what we did was we selected the name, the data label name only, because when the search, this particular filter only filters the name. So it doesn't filter any other thing, but this highlights all the table data. So we have that, and we also reset the highlight, in which case if something is highlighted here and when we click this, it resets that highlight. So that's basically all there is for this code. So I'm going to save this and let's go to the front end and see if this code works. I'm going to refresh this and then I'm going to type D. Okay, it's highlighting everything, so nothing is working here. So let's check the console and see if something is wrong here. That's a problem, it's not working. In this example, this was not a dynamic table, so let's see if the problem is from the dynamic side of things. Let's confirm this. I want to confirm all this. Okay, so I just spent a couple of time to realize that for repeater, so if we are using this code that I just wrote for repeater, the difference is that in the table row, so where I have my table row, the table data, the value here is inside a span because of the dynamic data, so it puts it inside a span. Normally on the normal table that we are not using, for instance this one, we are not using dynamic data for this one. You can see that the value is inside the table data itself, but for this the value is inside a span inside the table data. So that's why my code did not work, and I think it's a good thing that I had to do this tutorial on the dynamic elements even while my test table was on the regular table, which did not use dynamic data. So I've been able to update this code to accommodate the span, so using that span to select, you know, to target those table data, and it's working now. So if I press D, everything that has D in it, you know, will show up. So if I want to type U, everything that has U, E, everything that has E till, and then if I go, let's say the reset still works. So if I come here, of course the D, everything that has D work. If I hit 1, everything that has 1. If I hit 3, so this selects everything. So if I want to check how many people have passed, so I can just go to passed and I can see that these 3 people and all that. So that is so what I'm going to do is I'm going to provide 2 JavaScript codes. So the only thing that is changing is just the JavaScript code, just some minor changes. I'm going to provide 2 of them. So I'm going to provide one for the table that uses dynamic data in the repeater, and then I'm going to provide a code for a regular table that it doesn't use dynamic data. So you can use whichever one that suits you. So you can see everything works perfectly and is responsive. So if I come here and I can quickly type D-A-A, you know, and it is showing, but it's most useful if you use, we can style this and put a margin to separate this, but I'm not going to waste time with that. So you can see I can filter even on the dynamic mode. You can see that J, all the J's, you know, like J has a J in it. So yeah, that's basically all there is for this tutorial. So hit the like button if you like the tutorial, and also tell me in the comment what you think of it. If you have any idea or better ideas on how this can be implemented, let us know. Have a great day. I'll see you again.